I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Mazda CX-30. Mazda's decision to introduce the CX-30 to the Australian market a couple of years ago to sit above the CX-3 but beneath the CX-5 in terms of size was a fascinating gamble. There was a question of whether this SUV would cannibalize sales from both of those vehicles, and with so much data now available to us, we basically know the answer to that is no. Maybe the CX-30 took some sales off the new Mazda 3 hatchback, but basically this crossover has grown the pie for the brand in Australia, and Australians seem to really like the Mazda CX-30 if the sales numbers are anything to go by. In today's video, we will discover whether or not that preference for this Mazda SUV is well and truly justified. I'll also let you know which of the CX-3 variants I think makes the most sense to buy. Now, the particular one that I've brought along with me today is the top of the range X20 Astina, but while I will talk about how the Skyactiv-X engine works in this review, I'll be concentrating on the CX-30 as a product as a whole. So I'll let you know what you get on the Astina, what you'd miss out on the lower grade models, and I'll make a recommendation as to which one to buy. We'll also do our other usual parts. We'll go inside, we'll have a look at the back seats and the boot, we'll discuss the running costs, and then we'll head out onto the road in this CX-30 X20 Astina to see how it drives. Before we get started, hit subscribe down below. It's inside the Mazda CX-30 where this crossover really goes for the jugular up against its rivals, because the interior is almost premium grade. It really is very close, and certainly from a design perspective, the CX-30 looks miles more expensive than most of the vehicles this competes against. I mean, have a sit in something like a Mitsubishi ASX or the outgoing Nissan Qashqai, and this is just in a different universe. We've got this beautiful broad dashboard here with, like, it's faux stitch leather, but it does a pretty good impression. All of this soft material ensconcing the driver in this sort of cockpit here. Mazda have done a really good job of the interior design. It looks great. Now, the color schemes won't be for everybody. High spec CX-30s have a brown dashboard, brown trim down here. The base model has navy blue instead, which is definitely not going to be for everybody, but I personally like them, and I like that they've gone and done something different to just black plastic. But, you know, design is subjective, and you can let me know your opinion down below the video. Now, pretty much all CX-30s have a really nice interior. You don't have to buy the super expensive ones to benefit from lots of nice trim. And even the base model, the CX-30 Pure, which has small wheels and the best ride quality of any CX-30, that's just been upgraded to have a leather steering wheel and a leather gear shifter, which was the only thing that made me feel like it was not a car I would recommend, basically. Now that that's changed, even the base CX-30 is pretty much enough. But here at the other end, the X20 Astina, we do have quite a few extra creature comforts. We've got a sunroof, we've got power adjustment for the driver's seat with two-way electric lumbar. We get niceties like a Bose Premium stereo, heated seats, even a heated steering wheel. And the steering wheel itself is beautiful. The radius is quite large. It's probably a bit big for my liking, but the thin spokes, little airbag cover, little hidden paddle shifters, it's a beautiful looking steering wheel. Similarly, the seats, they're pretty good. Mazda seats are not my favorite in the industry. Maybe it's my body shape, which isn't quite right, but because these ones have power lumbar for the driver, I have been able to get more comfortable than I usually would, and there is a decent range of electric adjustment in the other directions as well. Plus, you sort of sit quite down into the cockpit of the CX-30, which makes it feel a bit more like a driver's car than some rivals where you tend to sit on top of it and feel like you're riding on like a sedan chair or something. The CX-30 isn't like that. We look forward at a mix of analog and digital gauges, analog tacho, oil temperature, and fuel gauge as well. And so they look quite clean. And in the middle, we've got a digital display for speed. For some reason, we have a second fuel gauge, which doesn't always completely agree with the mechanical fuel gauge. Strange bug. But I do think Mazda could probably do a bit more in the realm of digital instrument clusters, because right now it doesn't actually show us really anything that analog gauges weren't already showing us. Casting our eyes over here to the main screen, it's just under 9 inches in size. It's nice and crisp, high resolution. Mazda's new software actually works quite well, and you drive it through this rotary dial between the seats. It's not a touchscreen, and I appreciate this. Mazda have a philosophy that it's safer to drive the system through this rotary dial, which on bumpy roads, which we have in Australia, we have plenty of those, this system really is superior, so it gets my vote. Apple CarPlay and Android Auto are included, but you need to use a USB cable, and in a slightly dated feature, there are no USB-C ports in this car, only the old style USB, which doesn't charge quite as quickly, nor is there wireless charging. I believe it's available in some markets, but not this one. Instead, we've got storage ahead of the cup holders, decent space for your bottles, and between the seats, we've got a bin, we've got another USB port, a 12-volt port, and also extra bottle holders in the doors. So on the whole, it really is very, very nice up front. Let's check out those back seats. When you hear the name CX-30, it's not immediately clear how big or small this particular car is. Initially, there was confusion as to why Mazda didn't just call this the CX-4, because it actually does fit between the CX-3 and the CX-5 almost perfectly in the middle in terms of its size. But in actual fact, the move to the second digit, so CX-30 rather than CX-3, actually indicates that this is a Mazda Premium crossover, which is why the interior is so nice. It's kind of this new generation Mazda product. Now, we're almost certain that there is going to be a CX-50 that we'll see within the next 12 months, and that will be a little bigger than a CX-5, and it will also follow the Mazda Premium philosophy just like this car. But as I mentioned, in actual fact, it's a midsizer. It's a slightly larger, small SUV that fits between the CX-3 and the CX-5. And you can see that, you know, in a CX-3, you're very, very cramped in the second row. Here in the CX-30, legroom behind my own driving position, it's okay. The seat's cut out a little bit to help. Toe room is fine. And headroom, yeah, I've got another couple of inches, even though this car does have a cutout to accommodate for an open sunroof. Shoulder room, it's okay, but this is still a small SUV competing with the likes of the Volkswagen T-Roc, so it's not going to be enormous, but you could get someone in the center seat if you really had to, though it is a perch. We've got air vents back here. Now, the material's changed to hard on the sill, but you still get a soft armrest. On the door, you also get an armrest here in the center. So on the whole, it's a pretty nice way to travel, even if the best seats in the house are certainly the ones up front. Moving around here to the back of the Mazda CX-30, I think it wears this machine grey paintwork really well. Now, I know a number of you on our previous CX-30 videos have said that you don't like the fact that this car has a ton of plastic cladding. Well, the answer is to go for machine grey, black, or deep crystal blue, because those dark colors really do hide the cladding. On the lighter shades that you can get on the CX-30, including Soul Red, it really does look a little bit like lots of cladding. Still, here around the back, pretty much all CX-30s look the same, apart from the base model, which has its smaller 16-inch wheels. The top of the range X20, you'll only be able to tell from the badge, which reads Skyactiv-X as opposed to Skyactiv-G for the rest of the lineup. We do have a power tailgate here at the top of the range, and that opens promptly to reveal a 317-litre boot. Now, European spec CX-30s have a bigger boot because they must run without a spare wheel or something like that. But here on the Skyactiv-X, we have both all-wheel drive, and we also have a space saver spare, so it's a slightly smaller boot. Now, it's certainly not the biggest in the class. You can see I've jammed in our big suitcase already. I think I'm gonna have to put medium upright and then small, fit in like that. Then we do have controls here to lower the boot or to lower it and lock the vehicle. That closes up so you can get 3 suitcases in at a pinch. Last thing we'll do before we take this car on the road is to have a chat about running costs. So what's it going to cost you to run a Mazda CX-30? Well, it sort of depends on which of the 3 engines you go for, because that does dictate fuel consumption for starters, although not as much as you might expect. In our testing, the CX-30 with the Skyactiv-X motor used 8.5 litres per 100 Ks combined, whereas the regular petrols in the past have given us around 9 litres per 100 Ks. So there's not a huge benefit in terms of fuel consumption, is there? Now, servicing, no matter which of the engines, is done every year or 10,000 kilometres. Some rivals give you 15,000 Ks between scheduled stops. That's worth keeping in mind. And the CX-30 will set you back $1,785 across the first 5 services for this X20 variant. Insurance, over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $934 to comprehensively insure a new Mazda CX-30. everybody's situation varies and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, how you garage the car, your driving history, etc. And the warranty on the CX-30, like all Mazdas, is 5 years with unlimited kilometers. So what's the Mazda CX-30 like to drive, and which of the three engines make the most sense? And should Australia get the fourth engine of the CX-30, which is available overseas, but so far has been denied to us? So here in our market, it's a choice between three petrol motors. So the entry-level motor, the G20, is a 2-litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder petrol. The G25 is a 2.5-litre. And then this engine that I'm driving now, the X20, the Skyactiv-X engine, look, that had a lot of fanfare when it launched in Australia about 18 months ago, as it's pretty unique to Mazda. So this engine is what they refer to as spark-controlled compression ignition. Below around 4,000 RPM, it operates using compression ignition, so much like a diesel. It isn't a diesel engine, you fill it up with petrol, but it uses compression ignition at lower RPMs. And then as you rev through about 4,000 RPM, the general spark ignition takes over from that point, as it does in any petrol engine. And effectively, this is meant to do a few things. It's meant to reduce fuel consumption in the real world, also by way of the fact that this engine is a mild hybrid with an integrated starter generator mild hybrid system. And it's also meant to generate better low-end torque than Mazda's other naturally aspirated petrol engines, kind of in a way which would compete with a small displacement turbo. And on those two grounds, the CX-30 Skyactiv-X does kind of achieve the objective, but it's not as stark in the CX-30 as it is in the Mazda 3, which carries around a little less weight and also cuts a skinnier profile through the air. In our testing, as I mentioned in the running cost section, we found that the Skyactiv-X saves about half a litre per 100 Ks when compared to the G25, the 2.5 litre petrol engine. So it's not massive, and given that it comes at quite a significant additional cost, unless you're somebody that really does like the latest technology and you're pretty interested in how this system works, then I think for most people the X20 won't really be justified. The one thing I will say that it does really nicely compared to the G20 and the G25 is the start-stop system in the X20 is really refined, and as you start to decelerate towards a red traffic light or a stop sign through 20 k's an hour or so, the engine cuts out really gently because it has the beef of the mild hybrid system, which gives it a hand. So it's a fascinating engine. It saves a little bit of fuel, it's a little bit smoother and more refined, and it does have better low-end torque than the G20, but I think the G25 really feels just as strong in the real world, and it's cheaper. So on those alternatives briefly, the G20, the entry-level engine, the MX-5 engine, if you will, in the CX-30 body, it produces, well, certainly lower power than that sports car, 114 kilowatts and 200 newton meters of torque. And so it's really not going to get you anywhere that fast, the CX-30 G20, but it's happy to rev, it sounds good as it does it, and it gets the job done. So I think if you want to spend, under 35 grand on a CX-30 on that base car, then the G20 really is sufficient. But I think a lot of people would get something out of optioning up the CX-30 with the G25 engine, the 2.5 litre 4-cylinder, which makes 139 kilowatts of power and 252 newton meters of torque, if I have that right. Now the X20, by comparison, the one I'm driving here, makes 132 kilowatts and 224 newton meters. So the G25 in outputs is actually the flagship engine, and it feels really sufficient in the CX-30. It's kind of the most common engine in the CX-5, so when placed into this smaller, lighter SUV, the G25 really does feel sufficient. On top of that, there's optional all-wheel drive, which most people won't need, but if you regularly drive on low grip surfaces, then it's something you might want to consider. Almost every CX-30 spec sends torque to either the front or all four wheels by way of a 6-speed torque converter auto. Now, the tuning of this gearbox wasn't quite right when the CX-30 came out, but Mazda have addressed that issue. It's quite a bit less buggy. Now the shifts are pretty well timed, imperceptible most of the time, and the dedicated sport mode button is really good. It moves the shift points a little bit later, it more progressively downshifts under braking, and we've got the paddle shifters here as well, which is a nice touch. But the base car, the CX-30 Pure, you can actually have that with a 6-speed manual, which is a really nice arrangement, as the manual transmission really makes the best of that car's more modest outputs. But what the CX-30 is missing is one great engine, and overseas you can get the 2.5 turbo, the CX-9 engine in a CX-30, which would go like the clappers. Not that I know, because sadly between that engine kind of going into this car and the present day, there's been a small pandemic on, and so there hasn't been an opportunity to get overseas and drive it, and at present it's only engineered for left-hand drive. We think it's a packaging problem, but Mazda Australia continue to fight for it to be brought here in the Mazda 3 and the CX-30, so fingers crossed, because that engine with about 170 kilowatts of power and 420 newton meters of torque would be phenomenal in this car, and I think it really deserves it, because the underlying chassis of the CX-30 is pretty good. It doesn't have as sporty a bent to it as something like the Ford Puma perhaps, but it's really capable. It does a good job of balancing a pretty comfortable ride with decent body control. It doesn't try to be sporty. This isn't some kind of MPS variant or anything like that, or Mazda Speed as it's known in some markets. Instead, it's just trying to be a good blend that would suit most buyers, and I think that's what you get from the ride and handling of the CX-30. The steering is better than most. It's got a good intuitive ratio, well connected to the front wheels. It's kind of easy to plot a line, pilot it through a corner, and the rear end follows nicely no matter which of the two suspension options you have. Most CX-30s, all the front wheel drive variants have a torsion bar out back, whereas the all-wheel drive gets independent rear suspension. But to be honest, the tuning of both feels quite similar, and the torsion beam isn't unrefined like it is in some cars. It does the job okay in the CX-30, and as I mentioned, body control is good. It sort of lolls along nicely over low frequency imperfections on country roads, really keeps you feeling sort of secure and comfortable and centered. There's not a huge amount of head toss. A bit like the Mazda 3 though, where the CX-30's ride trips up is when the 18-inch wheels encounter a really hard edge or square edge bump in town. It just sends too much of a crash through to the cabin. And I think for the facelift of this car, which will happen at some stage next year, maybe the year after, attention should really be given on the damping for those sorts of bumps you encounter in town. There is a solution though, and that solution is called the CX-30 Pure, which runs on 16-inch wheels that look almost comically small, but they are encased in chunky tires. And because of all that extra rubber, all that extra insulation in the tire, the CX-30 Pure delivers a really good ride quality in town. So that's one reason why I'm pretty big on the base model CX-30 now that it's been given a decent rim for the steering wheel and covering for the gear shifter, no matter if you go for the auto or the manual in that car. But like other recent Mazdas, the CX-30 is really quiet inside. Mazdas used to be some of the loudest cars in terms of interior noise. They've completely turned that around, and this is a hushed car to ride in, with one exception. When you need the best out of any of this car's naturally aspirated petrol engines, they do require a rev, and you can hear it. Whereas rivals that tend to prefer small displacement turbo engines deliver that torque at low RPM, where the engine stays pretty hushed. And finally, the safety systems of the CX-30. Bit of a mixed bag. We do have the complete safety suite standard here at Astina level. And most of the systems work quite well. The lane holding feature is accurate, and it doesn't bing and bong, it doesn't embarrass you as a driver, it just has feedback through the steering wheel. The blind spot monitoring is conservative, but it works. My main issue is with the adaptive cruise control, which allows the speed to creep by up to 5 k's an hour higher or lower than what you've set, which is not acceptable in a country with significant speed monitoring like Australia, so that's a problem and that should have been tuned out. However, the forward collision warning was hugely sensitive when the CX-30 was released onto the market. That's also been fixed, showing you that Mazda does actually pay attention to those sorts of things and includes tech changes as they go. So I imagine the adaptive cruise can probably be fixed as well. And like all Mazda SUVs, reversing autonomous emergency braking is standard on the CX-30, which is great. So those are my thoughts on the Mazda CX-30. Good to refresh my perspective now that the car's been on the market for a couple of years, as things do move quickly in the SUV segment. But the thing is, the CX-30 is still a pretty easy car to recommend. It has that polished and comfortable interior. It drives pretty well, and the size is very handy if the CX-3 is too tiny for you, which for a lot of people it is, but you don't need to go all the way to a proper mid-size CX-5. Now, in terms of which CX-30 to buy, I would definitely check out the updated G20 Pure base model. Now that it has that leather steering wheel, it doesn't really need much more. It's a really good base model and a good way to save money. But at the other end of the lineup, cars like the Astina really do offer you a very complete set of premium features, but for quite a bit less money than you'd pay for something like Mercedes GLA or an Audi Q3 if badge anxiety isn't something that you really suffer from. That being said, I don't think I'd go for the Skyactiv-X. I think I'd just stick to either the G20 or the G25 engine, and not many people will need all-wheel drive either, to be honest. But if that is something you require because you live in a snowy area or a gravel road area, something like that, it's nice to know that Mazda can sell you one. Still, keen to know your view. Let me know down below in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.